So tonight I'd like to welcome Jeff Verona. He is here. He is the senior lecturer in the English department at UW-Wood County Marshfield. It has both things in the name.
Right.
So he is here. He will do a better job of introducing himself. And thank you. And
Thank you,
welcome.
Rachel. I very much like Rachel's idea of young adult novels for adults. I've been rereading the Harry Potter novels over the break myself, so back up to Order of the Phoenix again. I'm just amazed by Rowling's writing. It's just astounding. So yes, as Rachel said, I teach English at the University of Wisconsin, Marshfield, Wood County. I've also taught up here at Marathon, so I'm familiar with the faculty and the campus there as well. So. Tonight I'm going to be discussing the history of Sherlock Holmes. You can see from these two very well-loved volumes on the table here, about 40 years ago, my parents got me those books as a Christmas present. And I suspect that they're part of kind of how I became an academic in the first place. Because not only do they contain the Holmes stories and novels, but they also have a lot of, well, annotations. Simple things, like, for example, when they give a reference to an amount of money in the story, the annotation will explain what it is in modern American currency, for instance. But then more elaborate things, footnotes, endnotes, essays. The editor went through every story and determined the day that this adventure occurred based on internal evidence, what the weather reports were. They went back and looked at the London Times for 20 years, reading the weather reports every day, the phases of the moon, all that kind of stuff. And he would also talk about why other editors had different ideas about when this story took place. And I got exposed to this idea of academic discourse and dialogue. And I think it kind of was there in the back of my brain as I went through college and graduate school, and eventually led me to where I am today. So my particular area of specialty is speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, that kind of thing. And one area of interest is what I call the visual aesthetic of the future. If that sounds very academic, I can make it a lot simpler. If we can all just do a quick little exercise with me. You can, if it would help you to close your eyes to concentrate, you're welcome to. But I'd like to imagine that you are standing there and Sherlock Holmes is standing in front of you. And I want you to think about, what does Holmes look like? What's his face like? His eyes, his cheeks, his mouth. Does he have facial hair or not? What does his hair look like? How tall is he? What's his build like? Slim, heavy, right? Those sorts of things. Okay. Just think about that for a second, get an image in your mind. Okay. You can open your eyes again if you want. So how many people saw Benedict Cumberbatch? All right, okay. Well, some people didn't, some people
Basil
didn't.
Rathbone.
Basil Rathbone, there you go.
Sorry.
January 1st and January 8th, BBC America and PBS broadcast the most recent entry in the current Sherlock series, The Abominable Bride. How many people saw that? Okay. And of course, it's set back in 1890, which was the era that the Holmes stories were originally written. And this image of Cumberbatch as Holmes, we'll come back to it later on. Because even though he's an actor portraying Holmes 120, 130 years after the stories were written, you can trace a very clear line to how our mental picture of Sherlock Holmes came to be by beginning with those earliest stories and coming forward. And that's part of what we'll discuss tonight, as well as some other elements as well. But of course, before there was Holmes, there was Arthur Conan Doyle, who was, of course, the writer of Holmes. And before Arthur Conan Doyle, there was Dr. Joseph Bell. We sometimes forget that Conan Doyle actually was a physician before he was a writer. And he trained in medicine in Edinburgh, Scotland. And Joe Bell was one of his instructors. And as you can see from the quote here, Doyle believed that much of the character of Holmes was rooted in this real person, Joseph Bell. By the way, Bell's reply to this comment was, he says, "No, I'm not Sherlock Holmes, you are." Right? And you know that you are. So what was it about Bell that was so remarkable? Well, let me quote a little bit from some of his students. One of the remarkable features of Bell was he had these amazing powers of perception and deduction. Right? Sound familiar? So here's a quote from one of Bell's students describing how Bell was seeing a patient. He had never met this woman before. She just came to the surgery one day with a complaint. And other students were attending, watching him as he spoke to the patient. And this was the conversation. A woman with a small child was shown in. Joe Bell said good morning to her, and she said good morning in reply. What sort of crossing did you have from Bertisland? It was good. And you had a good walk up Inverleith Road? Yes. And what did you do with your other child? I left him with my sister in Leith. And would you still be working at the linoleum factory? Yes, I am. Hadn't seen this woman. Just walked in the door. That's what he said to her. You see, gentlemen, Bell turns to his face at this point. When she said good morning to me, I noted her Fife accent. And as you know, the nearest town in Fife is Bertisland. You notice the red clay on the edges of the soles of her shoes, and the only such clay within 20 miles of Edinburgh is in the Botanical Gardens. Inverleigh Road borders the gardens and is the nearest way here from Leith. You observe that the coat she carried over her arms is too big for the child who was with her, and therefore she set out from home with 2 children. Finally, she has a dermatitis on the fingers of the right hand, which is peculiar to workers in the linoleum factory at Bertisland. So, Holmes, his powers of observation and deduction are definitely grounded in an actual real person, somebody Doyle knew. And Bell's point of doing this with his students was to, obviously indicate to them that the patient will not always necessarily tell you what's wrong. Doctors, even in training today, it's one thing that gets said to them. The patient may say this and that, but they may not be able to really say what's wrong, so you need to observe. Another story from Bell comes to a lecture. He holds up a beaker. This, gentlemen, announced Professor Bell, contains a very potent drug. To the taste, it is intensely bitter. It is most offensive to the sense of smell. But I want you to test it by smell and taste, and as I don't ask anything of my students, which I wouldn't be willing to do myself, I will taste it before passing it round. Here he dipped his finger in the liquid and placed it in his mouth. The tumbler was passed around. With wry and sour faces, the students followed the professor's lead. One after another tasted the liquid. Varied and amusing were the grimaces made. The tumbler having gone around was returned to the professor. Gentlemen, said he with his laugh, I am deeply grieved to find that not one of you has developed this power of perception which I so often speak about. For if you watched me closely, you would have found that while I placed my forefinger in the medicine, it was the middle finger which found its way into my mouth. Okay. All right, so following on from his medical training, as you can see here, he practiced medicine for some years, and his practice was never very successful. He was writing at the same time. He noticed his first story was published while he was going through his medical training. Okay. And because his practice was not doing so well, he decided to try to focus more on the writing, thinking it would be a way to bring in an income. The very first Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, was published in 1886, and was written in 1886, published in the 1887 edition of Beeton's Christmas Annual. And here we have the very first appearance of Holmes in print. And it kind of went absolutely nowhere, sank without a trace. So, Doyle, being a good writer, continued on. Now remember that although we associate Doyle and Holmes, the Sherlock Holmes stories are actually a very small part of Doyle's writings. He wrote a great many other novels and stories and nonfiction things. So, for him, Holmes was kind of a project that he was interested in, but obviously if it wasn't selling, he wasn't going to continue with it. The second Holmes novel, The Sign Before, appeared in 1890. Again, pretty much went nowhere. So in desperation, he decided to create a series of short stories involving Holmes. And as far as I've been able to determine, this was the first attempt by a British writer to involve one character in a continuing series of stories. Obviously, short stories have been published in English before, right? And sometimes you would have a story or a character appear in multiple stories. Poe, for example, did this in America. But I believe Doyle was the first British writer to actually do this. So from April to May 1891, he wrote 6 Holmes stories. The first one was published in July, and where the novels didn't go anywhere, the stories did. They were published in the Strand magazine, which was kind of a large circulation London magazine. And because, you know, he'd been writing them and they had a stack to work with, they could just publish a whole series of them, and that really sparked public interest. So by October 1891, suddenly the public just fell in love with Holmes and wanted more and more Holmes. There were 6 more stories that year. Okay. I don't know if you've ever tried to write for a living. I have. It ain't easy. And that's a prolific rate of work. And then another 12 stories in 1892. Okay. As far as how much of a monetary success Holmes was for Doyle, it's kind of hard to tell. It's very difficult to translate money between eras. We can translate currency, right? But that's not the same thing as income. So as you can see, Doyle earned like £35 for studying Scarlet. The pound, of course, the British unit of currency. 35 per story for the first 6, 50% for the next, a flat 1,000 for the next 12. Well, we can compare that to his medical practice. He never earned more than £300 a year as a practicing physician. So if you think about a practicing physician today, right, that would give you kind of a rough idea of the money we're talking about. We also have some internal evidence to the stories. For instance, in A Case of Identity, Holmes notes that a single lady can get on very nicely upon an income of about £60. So if you're an unmarried single woman, £60 per year would allow you to live, in Holmes's estimation, comfortably, as middle class. In The Adventure of the Copper Beeches, a governess, like a nanny, reported that £50 per year was a typical salary for a position, and she was being offered £120, which was considered enormous. We're told in The Adventure of Black Peter that a harpooner on a whaling ship, I guess we can think of that as skilled labor, right, would earn £100 a year. So you can sort of keep these figures in mind to get a sense of how much money we're talking about here. And then, of course, in 1893, when the stories began to appear in America, that further bolstered Doyle's income. Within a few years, Holmes was, you know, was a big money machine. And, you know, like any author who's got a monster hit, there's this conflict. On the one hand, you want to keep writing the stories so the money keeps coming in, but on the other hand, you want to grow as a writer. You don't want to get stuck or pigeonholed. All is doing the same thing. So even as early as 1893, at the height of Holmes's popularity, Doyle began thinking about getting rid of him. Right? I went with my wife for a short holiday in Switzerland, in the course of which we saw the wonderful Falls of Reichenbach, a terrible place, and one that I thought would make a worthy tomb for Sherlock, even if I buried my banking account along with him. Right? Remember, of course, Doyle was a good Scotsman, you know, so they're notorious for their ability to squeeze a buck. So, all right. So in April 1893, he told his mother that he decided to give up on Holmes. He wrote in his diary, "Killed Holmes." There was a tremendous outcry, which I find fascinating. Conan Doyle heard of men who wept, of sober city men who even went to work wearing mourning bands. All right, now, to get a sense of the importance of this, short of ancient Egypt, you know, one culture that has really idolized the rituals of death would be Victorian England, right? Where when a woman became a widow, she wore nothing but black for the first year of her widowhood. And if she strayed even an inch from that, she would be, you know, socially condemned, right? Where people were hired as mourners at funerals. You could actually have a career as a professional mourner. Where coffins were elaborate works of art. And mourning bands, which is basically black armbands that you wore as a sign of public mourning. Somebody you knew died, someone in your family died, that kind of thing. Well, here are people wearing this funeral garb for somebody who never lived in the first place. Completely fictional character. This is new, all right? This has not happened before in popular culture. And there was, you know, tremendous outcry. Everybody wanted Doyle to write more Holmes stories. He refused, wouldn't do it, wanted to work on his other writing. Okay. And this went on for about 8 years. 1901, Doyle was on a golfing holiday in Norfolk when a friend told him a local legend about a ghostly hound. And he went home and wrote a story based on that legend, which became the Hound of the Baskervilles. But in the early drafts, Holmes does not appear at all. It's a completely different investigative character. And then at some point in the process, apparently Holmes or Doyle decided that this would make for a good Holmes story. And I believe his mother was encouraging him to do this as well. Throughout his lifetime, it seems like Doyle's mother was his primary confidant and advice giver. And she was never happy with the death of Holmes. And I think she kind of used this as a lever to get him to go back to Holmes. So when the Hound of the Baskervilles appeared in 1901, the magazine had to print 30,000 extra copies to meet the demand for Holmes. And then it was originally published in serial format, chapter at a time in a magazine, which was how many novels were published during the Victorian era, right? When it was actually novelized and sold as a bound novel in 1902, again, it was just enormous success, and that put Doyle back on the Holmes train, basically, for the large part of the rest of his career. His official return was in 1903, The Adventure of the Empty House, and then over the next 25 years, Doyle published a whole series of Holmes stories, including The Valley of Fear. Obviously, critical opinions are divided. Some critics think the early Holmes stories were the best. Even one of the readers of the Holmes fiction once commented that after Holmes came back from the dead, he wasn't the same as he was before. So, like anything else, I suppose it can change, it can vary. Okay. So, that gives us sort of a context to understand the portrayal of Holmes in art, on stage, in movies, okay? All the way bringing up to our current portrayals as done by Benedict Cumberbatch in the most current series of Sherlock. So a number of illustrators kind of shaped our image of what Holmes looks like. When we imagine in our mind what Holmes looked like, even Basil Rathbone's portrayal is based on the work of earlier illustrators and earlier actors. The major artists, I've labeled them up here. Sidney Paget, probably the most significant. I'll talk more about him in the beginning. Hyde, Steele, and Wiles. Steele and Wiles were American illustrators. Remember that when the stories were published in America, they were published in American magazines who had their own illustrators who did the illustrations. It's not like today where, something can be anywhere in an instant on the internet, right? So when Doyle sold the rights to the stories to the American magazines, they provided their own illustrations. And then William Gillette, we'll talk more about him later. A number of the visual cues we associate with Holmes come from Gillette's portrayal of Holmes on stage. This is Sidney Paget. He was the first of the Holmes illustrators. Personally, he's my favorite. And I think he contributed the most to our concept of what Holmes looks like. So he did the artwork for the original 24 stories that appeared in the Strand magazine, and Doyle actually specifically requested that he do the artwork for Hound of the Baskervilles. So I kind of interpret that as, in Doyle's mind, this is what Holmes looks like. So here are some of the early Paget illustrations, right? So what do we see here? Well, he's portrayed as, a man who's generally tall and thin. He's not standing in either of those, but you can tell from the shape of his body in the right-hand image. There's the pipe, of course, but does it seem different in any way?
Well, the actor you just mentioned,
William Gillette.
Gillette popularized the calabash.
Right.
Is that what you're referring to?
Right, so the pipe here is a straight pipe, right? And in fact, in all of the mentions of a pipe in the stories, it's a clay pipe, a briar pipe. It's always a straight pipe, kind of traditional pipe. And well, yeah, as you say, Gillette was the one who popularized the meerschaum or calabash, and there's a reason behind that as well. If you look at his face, very angular, the high forehead, the pronounced widow's peak, right? kind of aristocratic nose, if you will. Notice Cumberbatch portraying Holmes in 1890. It's almost like that Paget illustration come to life, right? The receding forehead, the slick back hair, right? The kind of angular aristocratic features. Frank Wiles also illustrated Holmes. You can see from here that, you know, in this image, and even, you know, that it's almost like the letter N has been carved into his forehead or something with that widow's peak. And the illustration of him reclining here is very similar to the one from Paget. We also see Watson, who also developed this sort of iconic portrayal as this sort of stout, mustached, round-haired British gentleman. And of course, Holmes again is with his smoking jacket and with his clay pipe, straight pipe. So, Frederick Steele, who portrayed Holmes in the American magazines, so he did the illustrations in color, right? So what do we see here? Well, for the first thing, on the left, we have the first image of Holmes wearing a deerstalker, right? Or sometimes referred to as a fore and aft. The history of Holmes and the deerstalker. Of course, Holmes, being a proper Victorian gentleman, would never leave the house without wearing a hat. But because he was a gentleman, he wasn't, you know, poor, he was middle class or better, it was also a proper hat, what we would call like a top hat nowadays. Cloth caps were associated with the lower classes. There are several occurrences in the stories where Holmes had to go in disguise, pretending to be a day laborer or something, and then he would wear a cloth cap for those purposes. When he traveled in the country, he would also wear a cloth cap. But the deerstalker per se is never mentioned anywhere in the stories. And it doesn't appear in any of the Paget illustrations. But it does appear in Steele, right? So again, this idea of the image of Holmes is kind of an additive thing. Over time, more things were accreted onto it till we get this image of Holmes as we see him today. We'll come back to this particular picture a little bit later on. So in 1899, William Gillette was an actor who put together this play, Sherlock Holmes. It's based on a failed play by Doyle and several of the Holmes stories. The movie version of it appeared in 1915. I've actually seen the film version of it. It's very similar to the play from what I can gather, and it sort of contains bits and pieces of different Holmes stories. It includes a romantic interest for Holmes, which is kind of like completely against the saga, you know, the official stories of Holmes. But
Not Irene.
no, it's not Irene. It's some poor working class girl. But you know, if you're gonna have a play, you got to have a love interest. You got to have some romance, right? So I think that's where that came from. And he portrayed them in London and New York, and like I said, he was in that movie adaptation. Although he wasn't the first person to adapt Holmes in movie, as we'll see. So here's Gillette's Holmes. Does this look familiar? If we go back to that illustration by Steele, right? And then, that's because Steele actually saw Gillette perform as Holmes, and that's what he based his illustrations on. So what do we notice here? Well, we still have the high forehead, but the hair is wavier. Right? Benedict Cumberbatch, anybody? Okay. The smoking gown, right? And then, of course, the pipe is the meerschaum or the calabash, the curved stem pipe, rather than a straight pipe. Again, the stories is all straight pipe, the illustration is all straight pipe. But the idea of Holmes with the curved pipe, this is where it comes from. It travels down through, well, Basil Rathbone, most famously. Why the curved stem pipe?
Vanity on the part of the actor?
A little more basic than that. Gillette couldn't actually speak the lines with a straight pipe in his mouth. But he could with a curved stem pipe. So that's where I started using it. It's interesting to see again how these things accrete and where all the pieces come from, right, over time. Yeah, so here we are again. On the left, we've got Gillette portraying Holmes as an actor. On the right, Steele's illustration of Holmes. Right? Virtually identical. Putting the hair aside, the rest of it is very similar. It's the same sort of angular features, beaky nose, right? Wide forehead. Okay. So the very first appearance of Holmes is in 1903, right? Not long after the modern motion picture came into being, which again gives you a sense of how enormously popular Holmes was, within a decade of his first appearance. As mentioned, Gillette was in that 1915 film. Some other actors who portrayed Holmes. British actor Ellie Norwood portrayed Holmes in 47 silent films starting in 1920. So even before we get to people like Basil Rathbone, there's a long film history of Holmes. Of course, John Barrymore, right, also portrayed Holmes. Got some pictures here. This is Ellie Norwood as Sherlock Holmes, right? So again, we can see a lot of the same imagery as apparent. The receding forehead, the widow's peak. He's got the slightly wavier hair. I think his face is a little fleshier, perhaps, in the early illustrations. Here's another one from the side. This one, he's smoking a pipe. A little hard to see, but it is meerschaum. Of course, he's got the violin, which is the instrument Holmes played. So you can kind of see how he is drawing inspiration from several different sources in his portrayal. Here's Barrymore as Holmes, right? Granted, these are publicity stills, so the makeup, which they used during that era, was very thick and pronounced because the technology of the era required it. But we see the curved pipe, right? We see the receding wide forehead, the receding hair. Right? That kind of trollish looking figure on the side is supposed to be Professor Moriarty. So Arthur Wantner was the first British actor who portrayed Holmes in a speaking role in the talkies after the silent era. And then, of course, Basil Rathbone, who portrayed Holmes 14 times during the 30s and 40s. So here we go. There's Rathbone, wearing the deerstalker with the curved pipe, right, coming from Steele's illustrations, coming from Gillette's portrayal. Wantner, who looks more like a Paget illustration, at least in my eyes, but with the curved stem pipe. Okay. Holmes in the small screen. Anybody remember the late 80s, early 90s Jeremy Brett portrayals of Sherlock Holmes, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes on Granada Television? Yeah, I was a huge fan of those when they came out. So this was Jeremy Brett as Holmes, David Burke as Watson in the first series, which is, I think, 6 or 8 episodes, and then Edgar Hardwick in the later series. Here's Brett as Holmes. And he's my favorite visual portrayal of Holmes, quite frankly. He looks very much like straight out of Paget illustrations, quite frankly. Especially here. Right? And then, of course, he has, the calabash as well. Brett had sort of a conflicted relationship with portraying Holmes. Kind of like Doyle did, right? Doyle was not entirely happy with Holmes consuming his life as a writer, and he wanted to be known for other things, so he kills Holmes off. But then, of course, he doesn't stay dead, right? Comes back, has to be more Holmes. Brett kind of felt the same way. At some point, he kind of felt that Holmes was sort of taking over his life. That he was finding it difficult to differentiate himself as an actor from Sherlock Holmes as a character. Then, of course, we had the modern portrayal, 2010, right? Sherlock with Cumberbatch as Holmes, Martin Freeman as Watson, right? So here's one of the regular stills from the show, and you can see influences of both elements, right? On the one hand, the general facial structure is very much like Paget, but we've got the wavier hair, like Gillette's portrayal. And even though he's wearing modern clothing, it's still, he's wearing an overcoat that looks very similar to a smoking jacket, and a scarf that looks very similar to an ascot. I'm assuming people are familiar with, right, this portrayal of Holmes. And even though it's modern and contemporary, a lot of his clothing still kind of echoes the clothing of the earlier eras. Right? You don't see Cumberbatch portraying Holmes in jeans and a t-shirt. Right? And of course the interiors as well, right? Their apartment at 221B Baker Street looks very, look at that wallpaper, right? It's straight out of the 1930s. Pretty much. Okay. I'd like to move a little bit from Holmes as a character to sort of the fandom of Holmes, right? In studying Scarlet, right, Holmes had what he called his own version of the Baker Street police force, the Baker Street Irregulars, okay, which were a group of street children, basically, who he used as spies, he used as source of information. As he says, they go everywhere, they hear everything, they're sharp as needles, they just need organization, which is what he provided. And following from that, people who were interested in Holmes created their own organization called the Baker Street Irregulars, which is, as far as I can tell, the first fandom, in the modern sense of the term, surrounding a fictional character. That is to say, a group of people with a shared interest in the character who go beyond simply possessing a separate shared interest. In other words, members of the Baker Street Irregulars gathered regularly, had conventions, if you will, public meetings, that they wrote fan fiction. Right? The technical term is pastiches, okay? But they wrote and published this fiction. They wrote and published scholarly articles about Holmes, right? And I think this is possibly the first earliest organized fandom centered on a fictional character. Their first meeting was in 1934. Their first branch was incorporated as a legal entity in 1935. On the science fiction side of the house, which is my area, the first science fiction convention was held in 1939, Worldcon in New York. So that actually predates science fiction fandom, even. And of course, as I said, nearly from the beginning, Trans and Holmes have added their own parodies, pastiches, fan fiction to the official stories, which are collectively known as the saga. The saga being the stories written by Doyle himself. And then all this other stuff has been added to it over the years. There's also a substantial body of scholarly criticism on Holmes. A number of famous writers have written Holmes stories. Dorothy L. Sayers, some of you may be familiar with, she wrote the Lord Peter Wimsey mystery novels. She kind of got her start as a writer of Holmes fiction. Even modern writers, like Stephen King, and Neil Gaiman, have used Sherlock Holmes in their stories. And then there are what I call the impressions of Holmes. All right, let me offer you an example. If you go to St. Bart's Hospital in London, St. Bartholomew's Hospital, there is a plaque on the wall outside the hospital. At this place, New Year's Day, 1861, were spoken these deathless words: "You have been in Afghanistan, I perceive, by Mr. Sherlock Holmes, in greeting to John H. Watson, N.D. at their first meeting." Baker Street Irregulars, 1953. Let's think about this for a minute. These are people creating an actual physical object in the real physical world, commemorating somebody who never actually existed. Right? Or if you go to Reichenbach Falls, you'll see a plaque there. It was put in 1957. This is the site where Holmes defeated Professor Moriarty. Except that never happened, right? It's not real, it's fiction. Or if you go to Baker Street today, right, you'll see this statue here. By the way, there never was an actual 221B Baker Street, right? If you look at the Ordnance Survey maps of London of that era, it never existed, right? Doyle made up the number, but people have devoted endless articles to determining exactly where on Baker Street, it was located. And this all is examples of things that the science fiction writer William Gibson termed the inversion of reality. Now, what did he mean by that? Well, you're probably familiar with the concept of virtual reality, right? The idea of a reality which exists within a computer matrix, like the movie The Matrix, which is based on Gibson's fiction. And a number of people have pointed out to Gibson, he wrote the novel Neuromancer about 30 years ago, where he actually invented the term cyberspace, virtual reality. And they said, well, what happened to this? How come we're not all plugging our brains into computers like the Matrix and going through these virtual worlds? And Gibson said, well, what happened is we did the opposite. We created a set of metadata and overlaid it on top of the virtual world. What does he mean by that? Well, if you've got one of these things, right, and you probably have a little application on this thing that does maps, right? And, you know, if I turn on my little feature, ask it to find me, right? Straighten it out here. Well, there it is, and you can even see the little blue dot that shows me where I am. Okay. So what's going on here? I'm taking information from the virtual world, and I'm overlaying it onto physical reality. Whenever you use your phone to say, well, where's the nearest Pizza Hut? That's what you're doing. You're drawing data from a place that does not exist to refer to places that do exist. And this is precisely the same thing that's happening here, right? These commemorative plaques for someone who never actually lived at all. So our sense of existence isn't necessarily tethered to physical reality. Doyle himself, even though he was kind of conflicted about Holmes as a character, did, I think, eventually realize that this was a significant contribution. Maybe not the one he wanted. I think he wanted to be remembered for other things which he's basically forgotten about for now. Doyle was a prominent spiritualist. You know, he believed in communicating with the dead and seances and that kind of thing. For any number of reasons, he had a son who died young and tragically, and was always attempting to communicate with him. And that's where he actually devoted a fair amount of his income, quite frankly, to this kind of stuff. And proving the existence of fairies and spirits and that sort of thing. Of course, he's not remembered for any of that, really. Instead, he's remembered for Holmes. So he's like, here's this great thing I invented, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it. Right? Not quite sure what to make of it in terms of my life and what I wanted to accomplish, but I think ultimately he realized, okay, this is what I'm going to be remembered for, and maybe there's a sense of, okay, maybe they have their own little place out there where they will always be. I certainly hope that's the case with these things as well. So, are there any questions? Sure.
You brought something to mind. I'm curious. Did anyone ever try to portray Mycroft? Orson Welles, unfortunately, never did. It would have been perfect. But,
I suppose so. Outside the current series, of course, where Mycroft appears.
yeah.
Right?
But before that, I mean,
Yeah, before
early
that?
on.
Trying to think of if Mycroft ever appeared in any of the films. I honestly, I don't believe so.
I've never seen it.
You know, Stephen Moffat, who is behind the current series of Sherlock, draws very heavily from the stories, and sometimes he follows them closely, and sometimes he drifts quite a bit away. But I think his introduction of Mycroft is kind of a new thing. I don't think he's really been portrayed before as a character, as part of the story. And then also, of course, Watson's wife, who's the contemporary portrayal of her is quite different than the saga. In fact, there's some argument as to how many times Watson was actually married. I've seen all sorts of figures that he had one wife, 2 wives, 3 wives, based on internal evidence in the stories. There's a famous passage where his wife calls him James instead of John. And maybe it was just a misprint, but there's a huge series of explanations of why did she call him James instead of John. It's like, well, his middle initial is H, so maybe it's Hamish, which is, you know, Scots for James, right? But that's the sort of thing that the critics of Holmes get into. this type of stuff. Of course, Mycroft was always portrayed when he did appear in the stories as Holmes' older and actually smarter brother, more perceptive. As Sherlock said, though, he would never be bothered to figure out if he was right or not. He didn't care to find out whether didn't want to go seek proof, would never stir from the Dionysus Club. So. But he was also, like he said, the British government, sort of the ultimate bureaucrat, which is sort of the way he's being portrayed now. I mean, there are lots of other eerie parallels as well. Like in the original stories, Watson was a medical doctor injured in Afghanistan. 100 years later, it's the same thing, right? Medical doctor injured in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I received the annotated Sherlock Holmes for Christmas maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Are those updated every so many years, or?
I'm not exactly sure. I think this is 67 that Baring-Gould did this. And I believe he may have even died before this was printed. I don't know if they're
very informative. Actually, I find them distracting. I really do. Because I end up reading the notes.
Right, yeah, exactly. I spend notes. And some of it's out of date, like the dollar amounts. They sort of try to do direct translations, and they're out of date. A lot of the other stuff I think is still good. And yeah, it is very distracting, but again, it was the sort of thing that maybe got me interested in this academic way of looking at the world, and this sort of discourse and conversation that happens between people that share an interest, an obsessive interest.
Mycroft is portrayed in, I think in both, at least one, and I think both of the Guy Ritchie movies, by the actor, the British actor who portrayed Jeeves in the BBC series. I don't remember his name, but
Stephen Fry.
yes,
If we're talking about the most recent
Yeah.
Jeeves and Woodhouse, that was Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie.
Stephen Fry. Yes.
Yeah, it was Stephen Fry. Okay, yeah,
And
sure.
of course, if anybody's an Elementary fan, Mycroft does appear fairly
Right.
regularly in Elementary.
Yeah, I didn't go into Elementary for this one because I wanted to stick with something that was more
Right.
traditionally Holmesian.
Baring-Gould is, I'm not sure about the updates to Baring-Gould. I know he's been dead for many years.
Yes.
But Leslie Klinger, who's a contemporary Sherlockian, has written a 3-volume annotated Holmes,
Oh.
which is in some ways a rehash of Baring-Gould, but also probably maybe the update you're looking for, if you're looking for one.
Yeah.
I agree that it can be distracting.
And of course, there have been other permutations of Holmes throughout time, right? There's the version where it's gender shifted, where it's Shirley Holmes, right? And Jane Watson, and of course all kinds of other variations like that, set in the past, set in the future, and that sort of thing. There's a science fiction version of Sherlock Holmes as an android in the future, and that kind of thing. So, right? He shows up in episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation.
I know Robert Downey played him in those most recent
Yep.
movies. Are there
2009.
anything in the works with him anymore? Do you know? I haven't heard.
I don't know, honestly.
They're kind
I
of
mean,
fun to watch. They were well done, I thought. So.
they were certainly different. They were a lot of fun. I think he's gotten kind of sucked into the Marvel movies things now. Avengers and Iron Man, and that's what's punching his meal ticket. So that's what he's doing currently. I mean, it is about money ultimately, right? That's why Doyle went into writing. He wasn't doing well as a doctor, and as you can see, just the history of Holmes itself is almost like a shoestring. He could have just given up after a sign of the four, tanked and said, "That's it. I'm gonna go do something else." Stuck in that one last time. That's when it happened.
What do you think makes him so appealing? That he lasted through time and has been reinvented.
I think there are a number of different ways to approach Holmes, right? A portrayal of a particular time and place. This late Victorian England and everything that goes with it. If you are a Brit, it can play very strongly with a sense of nostalgia. If you're an Anglophile, same thing. I mean, there was talk earlier about this Downton Abbey viewing group. Obviously, there are lots of people in America who have a real thing for British culture, and so that appeals to them on that front. There is this great tale of friendship, between Holmes and Watson. These two men who are friends for these decades, close comrades, that it's easy for us to think of ourselves as Watson, right? One of the interesting things about the Sherlock Holmes stories is, with a couple of exceptions, they're written in the first-person point of view, but the viewpoint character's not Holmes, it's Watson. Why is that, by the way?
And I would say that's because Watson's more appealing, he's more like the average person. He gives you a perspective that isn't Holmes' perspective,
Right.
which would be a bit erudite, I would think,
Right.
sort of removed
Very
from the
much
real
so,
world.
and it also seemed kind of strange that the stories like, I, Sherlock Holmes, went and looked at the evidence, I did, you know, he seemed like a raving egomaniac, right? And so we can have Watson, who's like us, right? He's not super brilliant, intelligent, or whatever, but he can say, why, Holmes, how did you ever figure that out? And then, of course, Holmes can explain it. You know? So there's that element as well, but there's also that deep element of friendship. Right? It, you know, Holmes sneers a lot about emotion. If you want to find maybe an excellent contemporary analog, I'm going to go
He's
back
the
to Harry
first
Potter.
Vulcan.
Professor Snape, right?
I was thinking Spock.
Yeah, that too.
Spock
That
is
too.
very
He's
Holmes.
definitely got a Holmes written, and Spock and Kirk have the same sort of relationship.
Yeah.
But if you remember, like the Harry Potter books, Snape is like sneering, condescending, distant, unlikable, but secretly has this deep emotional core to him. And Holmes is very similar.
He's also got his failings, his drug use. I mean, he's,
Mhm,
Yeah.
sure.
you know, he's not,
Has
he's
human
not,
elements.
he's not in command of himself at all times.
But, you know, I say all these nasty things to Watson constantly about how stupid Watson is and everything. But the few times in the saga where Watson is definitely in danger, Holmes comes through. One of the few times he actually shows strong emotion is when somebody takes a shot at Watson, somebody they're pursuing, the adventure of the three Garredips, he takes a shot at Watson, and Holmes just turns on the man in a fury and nearly kills him. So there's that element. Of course, there's also the element of you know, the triumph of science, right? That even the most puzzling, baffling of mysteries has a rational explanation based in actual reality, not in supernatural, not that kind of stuff. Anybody familiar with The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire? It's one of the Holmes stories.
Yeah,
Okay. Where
it seems inevitable that there's something, that the woman is guilty.
right, this woman is found over the body of her young child, then there's bloody wounds in the child's neck and blood under her mouth, and they assume, you know, there's all these rumors of vampires and everything. Remember that Dracula came out roughly the same time the whole story is. And from the get-go, Holmes is like, that's ridiculous. The supernatural does not exist, there are no ghosts, there are no vampires, right? And then he methodically proves that there actually is a real physical cause and reason for all of these things. So I think that's part of it too, this whole sense of, you know, science as this great saving human institution that can solve our problems and provide an explanation that anyone is capable of understanding, and it doesn't rely on mysticism. So I think that's part of the reason for its popularity.
In my case, when I had books of my grandfather when I was 8, 9, 10, 11 years old and was reading the Holmes stories. And I'd read them 10 years later and 10 years after that. And I'd forget actually the story as far as what the explanation was and what the mystery was and so forth. It was just the ambiance that I liked about the stories. And I used to be amazed that from time to time I'd think, well, I'm reading this again, how can I be, I've read this thing 3 times already.
Yep.
And I'm still enjoying it, and I think part of it was I didn't remember the story. I wasn't interested so much in the mystery. I was interested in these two characters. And suddenly in the night, the game's afoot. We have to get and rattle through the streets of London.
And of course, the whole series is kind of a love letter to London as well, the way that the city's
Right,
portrayed
right.
as its own sort of character.
For those of us who love London because we lived there and whatever, it is an added layer, of course.
Of course, and even if you've never been there, you know, it's a place where you can have a home in your imagination. And to go there and visit and be there in Holmes's London, be walking the streets with him in that period. Are there other questions or observations, or points you'd like me to address?
I've I don't know at what point you're at, I don't wanna intrude into your presentation.
Sure.
But I got two or three, I came with an agenda.
Oh, fire away.
Are you sure? Okay. Well, I went to your, you sponsored a series of lectures down at Marshfield a couple of years ago, I believe.
Mhm, right.
And I was able to make several of those. And I tried this there too, but I'd be very interested in starting a Sherlock Holmes group, based in, well, I tried Marshfield, based in Marshfield, Wausau, central Wisconsin. You mentioned BSI, the Baker Street Irregulars. You don't get named BSI very easily at all.
Right.
Those are some pretty distinguished people. But one thing they do, they're pretty liberal with is they will sanction a scion society most anywhere. Barry and I belong to the one in Madison. I occasionally go to the one in Janesville.
Oh, okay.
And so, I will hang around. And if anybody has any remote interest in starting a group here, I would love to facilitate that. Most of the time, hardly ever are there any dues or real obligations. The one in Madison, we meet once a month and talk about a story selected for that occasion. The Janesville one operates similarly. I know a lady who runs the one in Iowa City, very similar format, so there's really nothing to worry about. But if you're a Holmes enthusiast and you'd like to just kind of keep up on a regular basis, I won't speak for Barry, but I know I and maybe the two of us would be very interested in getting together.
And that's something I'd be interested in too.
So maybe we could even have a central Wisconsin one that has various meeting sites in even different cities. So hang around and let us know if you're interested. You mentioned the various conventions and national meetings. I wanted to mention the Norwegian Explorers in the Twin Cities sponsor a national, and actually an international conference every third year,
Oh, okay.
which is one of the best ones going. I've gone to the past 3 or 4 of them, and that's coming up in June. And all you need to do is Google Norwegian Explorers probably and get all the information on that. And it's very worthwhile. It's a Friday, Saturday, and then a little bit on Sunday, 3-day meeting. So that's a good deal if you can get away and if you have that level of enthusiasm. If I may, Barry, my friend Barry Brisman, you mentioned Sherlock Holmes pastiches. Barry has written, what's the count now, 4? 4,
Mhm.
under the Cinnamon Barry Grant. I've reviewed a couple of them. They are excellent. They rank, I think, as high as any. So the name is Barry Grant, and I don't know where you can get the books, Barry, but.
They used to be on sale on Amazon. It was from about 2010 until the present day. It's sort of about one a year. I don't actually know. I think the library might have some. But the editor, it's a press in England called Severed House. And they publish a lot of things for libraries they aim at largely. But anyway, this editor, for some reason, didn't want me to use my own name, Barry Brisman. And I don't know whether he thought, I still don't know why. And he said a condition of taking the book, and he took the first 2 right off the bat. I've been trying for years to sell one, and my agent said, well.
You are on Amazon.
I am?
We just checked. You can buy it on
Right,
Amazon.
thank you. So anyway, lo and behold, the guy said, well, I need at least two books before I can make any money on this. And my agent said, well, he's got a second one, because I foolishly had gone ahead writing.
Never foolish to write a second one.
So they took the book, and it's been fun. And I then was working in Madison, so I met Jim Briggs, he was an English teacher as well, here in town, right, Jim?
Yeah.
And so that's it. It's very. So he said, the editor said to me, the guy who ran the company and was my editor, said, "What's your middle name?" And I said, "Grant." And he said, "Well, what about Barry Grant?" And that, so I settled for it. And that should, Barry is Irish and Grant is Scottish and English, and the Welsh will just have to make do with the French.
Maybe he didn't like the Welsh, or maybe there was another writer already with,
Yeah,
that name.
so that was what I, so I don't, this is not an advertisement for me, but Jim wanted to bring it up. And so I have 4 books, the first of which is The Strange Return of Sherlock Holmes. It's set during World War I.
Oh, okay.
And he,
After his last bow, which.
well, on August 4th, as you know, the war was, and that was the last, 1914, the last story that was written in terms of time. So I have my Sherlock Holmes make his way to, the King of England, as you know, was a cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm. And so in order to stop the war, he sends Holmes on a mission. Holmes gets buried in a glacier and doesn't wake up until 2010. So we get the old Holmes in the new world. That's the idea.
Mhm. Excellent. So yeah, I mean, it certainly gives a sense of the strength of Doyle's creation that, 100 years on, people are still writing.
People are still bothering to, yeah.
People are still creating from the things he's given us. And that he's still popular, the Sherlock series, the Elementary series, right? The movies, right? They're still present.
It's sort of a comment, sort of a question. When you were talking about the appeal
Right.
of the character. See, for me, and I begged my mother for that book for Christmas. I decided, and as I told him, disappeared for a whole weekend.
Right.
Just like, no, I don't want to talk to anyone. It was the single-mindedness
Mhm.
of the character
Mhm.
that sort of grabbed me. Was that sort of character very popular in Victorian times? Can you think of other examples? I wouldn't know. But he was, very single-minded when he didn't have a case. He was doing cocaine, playing violin, and being
Right,
depressed.
right.
He just didn't want to live, practically,
Mhm.
if he had nothing to pursue intellectually.
Well, Holmes himself references other fictional detectives like Poe's author and so on, mostly in a dismissive kind of way. But, when Doyle was writing, he was paying attention to those writers and perhaps citing Holmes somewhere in that context. And there's a very old tradition of the investigator, if you will, the person who pursues the criminal and seeks justice. And although Holmes never goes to court, although a number of commentators have always pointed out that he has this tremendous knowledge of the law
Yeah.
that he can deploy, there's that element too. So it's also part of just that old, morality sense of seeking justice. Right. And in Holmes' cases, since it's primarily murder that he deals with, the person who's been affected can no longer speak for themselves. So it's important that he speak for them. I think there's one example of a case where a client consulted Holmes and then was killed. And that was one case where Holmes was really, upset. He was upset at the idea that this person came to me and I owed him an obligation and I failed in my obligation. And now all I can do is, get justice. So I think there's that dimension to it as well. I mean, you see parallels with like the American Western, with the sheriff and that kind of thing. So that's a very, very old idea too. But, obviously Doyle tapped into something, right? Writers do that from time to time.
Yes.
And they can't necessarily explain how or why, but they just do, right? So that's clearly a large part of it as well. I'm wondering if today, if we use modern terminology, Holmes might be viewed as like somewhere on the autistic spectrum maybe, or something like that almost. I don't know. I don't like judging prior errors with the language
He'd be
of
medicated,
contemporary
yeah.
errors. Yeah.
They'd want to medicate him.
Medicated or that kind of thing. So, but I mean, there are when he does, on the few occasions where he does come out of this shell, he does show emotion, humanity. He does at one point talk about education and the importance of education. He's talking about like the British public school system primarily, but the sense of we've got this knowledge and this science, and it's a light in the darkness, you know, and it needs to be cherished. Other questions?
Just, I could just add to, maybe if anybody's interested in this meeting, having a Sherlock Holmes club, so to say. One thing I could add is that many of them take a story per month and go through the stories. And they're all over the world, these clubs. In fact, I think I read one place, is that right, Jim, where Japan has the biggest club of all? I'm not sure if that's.
Would not surprise me.
That's true, but I mean, they're all over the United States and all over the world. And many of them have one novel per month that they, or one book, one story per month that they treat. And then they have all kinds of other things, go to movies, you know, go to the Sherlock Holmes movies together, discuss the movies afterwards. So I suppose that's the kind of thing you have in mind, Jim. Sure.
Sure. Something that would be wonderful, and I would certainly encourage people to get involved, and I'll put my name down as well. But again, from my perspective, it sort of speaks to the strength of that fandom, the appeal of Holmes, and the persistence of Holmes, and of course also this persistence of this image of Holmes, of what he looks like and how it came to be portrayed that way. So, thank you for coming out, especially on a cold night. I do appreciate it. And I wish you continued joy in your readings and rereadings of the saga. It's probably time for me to go look at it again myself. So. Well, thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Please speak with these gentlemen over here about getting more involved.